The auction platform stood crooked in the center of Carterville's dusty square, a makeshift stage built from stolen barn wood and shame. Noon sun beat down without mercy, and the air hung thick with the smell of horses, sweat, and something darker, the rot of a town that had learned to look away. A man knelt on the platform. His wrists were bound behind his back with frayed rope, his shoulders pulled at an unnatural angle that made the muscles in his neck stand taut. His shirt, once white, now gray with dust and dried blood, hung open at the collar. His head bowed forward, dark hair falling across his face, hiding his expression. But his breathing was visible, short, shallow, the kind of breathing that comes when shame is heavier than fear. "Don't look at me like that," he whispered, though no one specific stood close enough to hear. His voice cracked. "Please, not like this." The auctioneer, a thick-necked man named Calhoun with a face like sun-baked leather, grinned and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. He circled the kneeling man slowly, boots thudding against the wood, each step deliberate, performative. "Next item," Calhoun announced, his voice carrying across the square. "Young man, maybe 26, 27, strong back, good with horses, I'm told, no family to speak of, been working the Brennan spread for 3 years before." He paused, letting the silence do the work. "Well, before he got himself in debt he couldn't pay." A few townspeople had gathered, though most kept their distance. Some watched from storefronts, others pretended to be busy tying horses or adjusting saddles. No one met anyone else's eyes. The man on the platform lifted his head slightly. His face was lean, sunburned, with a split lip that hadn't healed right. His eyes, gray, tired, scanned the crowd with something beyond humiliation. It was resignation, the kind that comes when you've already died inside and are just waiting for your body to catch up. "Starting bid," Calhoun said, "is $50, contract length, 3 years labor. You get his hands, his time, and his silence." He chuckled at that last part, though he don't say much anyway. No one moved. Calhoun's grin faltered. "Come now, $50 for 3 years of work, that's a damn bargain, and you all know it." Still nothing. Then from the edge of the square, a horse shifted. Boot heels hit the dirt, steady, unhurried. A man stepped forward, broad-shouldered and weathered, maybe 50 years old, with a gray-streaked beard and eyes that had seen too many things to be shocked anymore. He wore a cattleman's hat, a worn duster, and a Colt revolver low on his hip, the leather holster darkened with years of use. His name was Samuel Harding. He owned a ranch 10 miles west of town, a spread that had survived drought, raiders, and the war. People knew him as a fair man, quiet, the kind who didn't involve himself in town politics or other men's business. But he was here now. Samuel walked slowly toward the platform, his gaze fixed on the kneeling man. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe, or memory, but it passed too quickly to name. $50, Samuel said, his voice low and even. Calhoun's grin returned. "Well now, Mr. Harding, didn't expect to see you at." $50, Samuel repeated, cutting him off, "and I'll take the contract." The kneeling man's head snapped up. His gray eyes locked onto Samuel's face, and for a moment, something passed between them, confusion, disbelief, maybe a flash of old pain. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Calhoun clapped his hands together. "Sold to Mr. Harding, $50, 3-year contract, pay at the office and he's yours." Samuel didn't look away from the man on the platform. He reached into his coat, pulled out a worn leather pouch, and counted out the coins with deliberate care. He handed them to Calhoun without a word, then turned and walked toward the platform. The kneeling man's breathing quickened. Samuel climbed the steps, his boots heavy against the wood. He stopped in front of the man, looked down at him for a long, silent moment, then crouched low so they were nearly eye level. "Can you stand?" Samuel asked quietly. The man's jaw tightened, his voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Sir, I don't deserve this." Samuel's expression didn't change. He reached behind the man, pulled a knife from his belt, and cut the ropes binding his wrists with one clean motion. The frayed ends fell away, and the man's arms dropped forward, trembling. Samuel stood, sheathed the knife, and extended a hand. The man stared at it. His hands shook as he lifted them, raw, rope-burned, dirty, and hesitated. "Take it," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. Slowly, the man reached up. Samuel gripped his forearm and pulled him to his feet. The man swayed, unsteady, but Samuel held him upright until he found his balance. The crowd had gone silent. Calhoun stepped forward, frowning. "Mr. Harding, you know the terms. He works for you now, contracts binding." "I know the terms," Samuel said without looking at him. He turned to the man beside him, whose gray eyes were still wide with confusion and something else, fear maybe, or the faint, fragile edge of hope. "What's your name?" Samuel asked. The man swallowed hard. Tobias Mercer." Samuel nodded once. "Come on, Tobias." He turned and walked down the platform steps, and after a moment's hesitation, Tobias followed. His legs were unsteady, his gait stiff, but he kept moving. The townspeople parted as they passed, some watching with curiosity, others with something harder to read. Samuel's horse stood tied near the edge of the square, a sturdy roan mare with kind eyes. Samuel untied her, then glanced back at Tobias. "You ride?" Tobias nodded, though his voice was barely there. "Yes, sir." "Good." Samuel swung up into the saddle, then reached down. "Climb up behind me. We've got a ways to go." Tobias hesitated again, his eyes searching Samuel's face for something, cruelty, mockery, a trap. But Samuel just waited, hand extended, expression unreadable. Finally, Tobias took the hand and pulled himself up behind the saddle. His movements were awkward, pained, but he managed. He gripped the saddle's edge, careful not to touch Samuel more than necessary. Samuel clicked his tongue, and the mare started forward at a steady walk. As they left the square, Tobias glanced back once at the platform, at Calhoun counting his coins, at the townspeople already turning away. His hands were still shaking. "Sir," Tobias said quietly, his voice thick, "I don't understand." Samuel didn't answer right away. They rode in silence through the dusty streets, past the general store, past the church with its crooked steeple, past the saloon where men were already drinking away the afternoon. Only when they reached the edge of town, where the road opened into open grassland and the distant mountains rose like broken teeth against the sky, did Samuel finally speak. "You will," he said. And they rode west into the falling light. The ride to Samuel's ranch took 2 hours. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the prairie, and the air cooled enough to make Tobias shiver. He hadn't spoken since they left town, and Samuel hadn't pushed him. The silence between them was thick, but not hostile, more like the quiet before a storm that both men knew was coming. When the ranch finally came into view, a modest house, a barn, corrals, a windmill turning slowly in the breeze, Tobias felt something tighten in his chest. It looked normal, peaceful, even. It didn't fit with what he expected. Samuel reined the mare to a stop near the barn and dismounted. Tobias slid down after him, his legs stiff and aching. He stood there, uncertain, while Samuel led the horse inside and began unsaddling her. "You hungry?" Samuel asked, his back turned. Tobias blinked. Yes, sir." "Go inside. There's bread and stew left from this morning. Help yourself." Tobias didn't move, his hands clenched at his sides. "Sir, I." Samuel turned, his expression still calm, still unreadable. "Tobias, go eat. We'll talk after." It wasn't a command, it was just permission. Tobias swallowed hard, nodded, and walked toward the house. Inside, the house was simple but clean. A stone fireplace, a wooden table, a few chairs, shelves lined with books, a rifle mounted above the mantel. Tobias found the stew pot hanging over low coals, still warm. His hands shook as he ladled it into a tin bowl. He ate standing up, too anxious to sit. The stew was good, better than anything he'd had in weeks, but he barely tasted it. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why had Samuel bought him? What did he want? And why did Samuel's face seem so familiar? The door opened, and Samuel stepped inside. He hung his hat on a peg, rolled his shoulders, and moved to the table. He sat, gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," Samuel said. Tobias obeyed, slowly lowering himself into the chair. He set the bowl down, his hands still trembling. Samuel studied him for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "You don't remember me, do you?" Tobias frowned. "Sir." "8 years ago," Samuel said, "you were younger, thinner. You worked for a man named Jacob Mercer, your father." Tobias went very still. His breathing stopped for a heartbeat, then started again, faster. "How do you?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. "Your father had a small spread south of here, good land, water rights. He'd built it up over 10 years after the war, but there were men with money and lawyers, who wanted that land." He paused. "One of those men was my brother." Tobias's face went pale. "My brother, Edward Harding," Samuel continued, his voice steady but laced with old pain. "He was ambitious, ruthless. He got a judge to rule that your father's land claim wasn't valid, some old technica. Litty from before the war. Your father fought it, but Edward had connections, had men." Samuel's jaw tightened. "One night, Edward sent riders to your place, told them to scare your father off. But things escalated." Tobias's hands gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles went white. "They burned it," he whispered. "They burned everything, my father." His voice broke. "He tried to stop them. They shot him." Samuel nodded slowly. "I know." "You know," Tobias's voice rose, cracking with sudden fury. "You know." "I was there," Samuel said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Tobias stared at him, his grey eyes wide, disbelieving. "You were." "I rode with Edward's men that night," Samuel said, his voice flat, emotionless, but his eyes betrayed him. "There was shame there, deep and old. I didn't know what they were planning. Edward told me we were just going to talk to your father, convince him to sell, but when we got there," he exhaled slowly, "I saw the torches, heard the shouting. I tried to stop them, Tobias. I swear to God I tried, but they didn't listen. And when your father came out with that rifle, they shot him in the chest," Tobias whispered. "He bled out in front of me, and his voice cracked again. "I couldn't do anything. I was 16, I had nothing." Samuel nodded. "I know, I saw you that night, saw you kneeling beside him. He paused, his throat working. "I rode to the marshal the next morning, told him everything, but Edward had already paid him off. Nothing happened. Edward took the land, sold it a year later." He looked down at his hands. "I cut ties with him after that, haven't spoken to him in 7 years." Tobias's breathing was ragged now, his chest heaving. "And you think that makes it better? You think buying me off an auction platform fixes what you—" "No," Samuel said firmly, "it doesn't. Nothing fixes it." Tobias slammed his fist on the table. "Then why bring me here, why?" "Because I owe you," Samuel said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "Because I was there, and I did nothing that mattered. Because your father died, and you lost everything, and I went home and kept living my life like it didn't happen." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Tobias's. "I can't undo it, but I can do this." Tobias stared at him, his jaw trembling. "You think this is mercy?" "No," Samuel said. "I think it's the least I can do." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the windmill creaked. Finally, Tobias looked away. His voice came out broken, raw. "I hate you." "I know," Samuel said. "I should kill you. Maybe." Tobias squeezed his eyes shut. A single tear slid down his cheek, and he wiped it away furiously. "Why didn't you just leave me there?" "Because you deserve better than that platform," Samuel said. "You always have been." Tobias's head snapped up. "What?" Samuel's expression softened, just slightly. "Deserving of something better than what this world gave you." Tobias didn't respond. He just sat there, trembling, caught between rage and something else, something he couldn't name. Samuel stood slowly. "There's a room in the back. It's yours, no locks, no chains. You can leave anytime you want, but if you stay," he paused, "you stay as a man, not a servant, not a debtor, a man." He walked toward the door, then stopped and looked back. I don't expect forgiveness, Tobias. I don't deserve it, but you're here now, and I'll do right by you, that's a promise. Then he stepped outside, leaving Tobias alone in the flickering firelight. 3 days passed in uneasy silence. Tobias stayed, not because he'd forgiven Samuel, he hadn't and maybe never would, but because he had nowhere else to go. And because, despite everything, Samuel kept his word. He gave Tobias space, food, work that wasn't cruel or demeaning, mending fences, feeding horses. Simple, honest labor. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was functional. Pass the hammer, water the mare, stew's ready. But there were moments, small, fleeting, where something shifted. Samuel showing Tobias how to repair a saddle strap. Tobias wordlessly handing Samuel a tool before he asked for it. A rhythm forming, tentative and fragile. On the 4th morning, that rhythm shattered. Tobias was in the barn, brushing down Samuel's roan mare when he heard the hoofbeats, multiple riders, coming fast. He froze, brush in hand, and looked toward the barn door. Through the gap, he could see dust rising on the road. 5 riders, maybe 6. They weren't slowing down. Samuel emerged from the house, his hand resting on the colt at his hip. His expression had gone hard. The riders pulled up in front of the house, horses snorting and stamping. The man in front was tall, dressed in a fine coat and polished boots, too fine for ranch country. His face was sharp, angular, with cold blue eyes that swept over Samuel like he was calculating a price. Edward Harding. Tobias's stomach turned to ice. Samu. Edward said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant. Been a while. Not long enough, Samuel replied evenly. Edward smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I heard an interesting story in town. Heard you bought yourself a worker off Calhoun's platform, paid $50 for a 3-year contract. He tilted his head. That true? It is. Curious, Edward's gaze shifted, scanning the ranch and landed on the barn. On Tobias, half hidden in shadow. Mind if I see him? Yeah, Samuel said. I do. Edward's smile faded. Samuel, don't make this difficult. I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to make sure everything's legitimate, you understand. Legitimate, Samuel repeated flatly. That's rich coming from you. Edward's jaw tightened. Careful, brother. I'm not your brother, Samuel said. Haven't been for 7 years. One of the riders, a thick-set man with a scar running down his cheek, shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. Samuel's eyes flicked toward him, and the man froze. Edward raised a hand, signaling his men to stay calm. I'm going to give you one chance, Samuel. Send the boy out. Let me see him. If everything's in order, we ride away, and you never see me again. And if I don't? Edward's expression hardened. Then I'll assume you're hiding something, and I'll come back with the marshal, maybe a few more men. Maybe we'll take a closer look at your land claims, your water rights. You know how these things go. So here's the question that changes everything. If you were Samuel, knowing what Edward did to Tobias's family, would you hand him over? Or would you stand your ground, even if it meant losing everything? Take a breath, think about that. Because what Samuel did next would define not just his own fate, but Tobias's. Samuel stood silent for a long moment, his hand still resting on his colt. Then, slowly, he stepped aside. Tobias, he called, come out here. Tobias's heart hammered in his chest. For a moment, he considered running out the back, through the fields, anywhere but here, but something stopped him. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the faint, stubborn belief that Samuel wouldn't betray him. He stepped out of the barn. Edward's eyes narrowed as Tobias approached, his gaze raking over him. Recognition flickered across Edward's face, then vanished, replaced by cold amusement. Well, Edward said softly, Jacob Mercer's boy, I'll be damned. Tobias said nothing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Edward turned back to Samuel. You know who he is. I do. And you bought him anyway. I did. Edward laughed, a short, bitter sound. Samuel, you self-righteous fool, you think this makes up for anything? You think dragging this wretch into your life changes what happened? I don't think it changes anything, Samuel said quietly, but I'm done pretending it didn't happen. Edward's smile vanished. His voice dropped, cold and dangerous. You're harboring a man with debts, Samuel, legal debts. That contract is binding if you interfere. Then interfere, Samuel interrupted. File your complaint, bring your marshal, but Tobias stays here. Edward stared at him, his eyes blazing. You'll regret this. Maybe, Samuel said, but I can live with that. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, stirring dust around the horse's hooves. Then Edward jerked his reins and turned his horse. Let's go, he snapped to his men. They rode off, fast and angry, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Samuel exhaled slowly. He didn't look at Tobias, just stood there staring after them, his hand still on his gun. Tobias's voice came out rough. He'll come back. I know, Samuel said. With more men. I know. Tobias stepped closer, his grey eyes searching Samuel's face. Why risk everything for? Because some things are worth standing for, Samuel said simply. And for the first time since that night 8 years ago, Tobias believed someone might actually mean it. That night Samuel didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, rifle across his lap, watching the road. Tobias found him there near midnight, a blanket draped over his shoulders against the cold. You should rest, Tobias said quietly. Samuel shook his head. Not tonight. Tobias hesitated, then sat down beside him on the steps. For a while neither spoke. The night was vast and clear, stars scattered across the sky like thrown salt. My father used to say, Tobias began, his voice low, that a man's word was the only thing that couldn't be taken from him, that even if you lost everything else, land, money, family, you still had that. He paused. I stopped believing that after he died. Samuel nodded slowly, hard not to. But you kept your word, Tobias said. These past days, you did what you said you'd do. Doesn't undo what I didn't do, Samuel said. No, Tobias agreed, it doesn't. They sat in silence again, then Tobias spoke, softer now. I don't forgive you. I don't know if I ever will. I don't expect you to. But I don't hate you as much as I did 3 days ago. Samuel glanced at him, something shifting in his weathered face. That's more than I deserve. Tobias pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. Why didn't you stop them, really, that night? Samuel was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice was raw. Because I was a coward. I told myself Edward was my blood, that family came first. I told myself your father would be fine, that they'd just scare him. But deep down, he shook his head. I knew what kind of man Edward was, and I rode with him anyway. And now I know that blood doesn't mean a damn thing if it's built on other people's grave. Tobias looked at him, really looked at him. Saw the lines around Samuel's eyes, the weight he carried, the quiet, stubborn decency that had brought him to that auction platform 4 days ago. He'll come back, Tobias said again. Edward, he won't let this go. I know. So what do we do? Samuel met his gaze. We stand. Just the two of us. If that's all there is. Tobias exhaled slowly. That's not much of a plan. No, Samuel agreed, but it's honest. A faint smile tugged at Tobias's lips, brief, fragile, but real. You're a strange man, Samuel Harding. Been told that before. They sat together until dawn began to grey the horizon, and when the sun finally rose, casting long shadows across the prairie, Tobias stood and offered Samuel his hand. Samuel looked at it, surprised. I'll stand with you, Tobias said quietly, not because I forgive you, but because you stood for me. Samuel took his hand and shook it once, firm and steady. Thank you, Samuel said. Tobias nodded. Then he turned and walked toward the barn to start the day's work. Samuel watched him go, something easing in his chest. Not redemption, not yet, but maybe the faint beginning of it. Edward returned 2 days later, but he didn't come alone. This time he brought 12 men, hired guns, ranch hands, a few townspeople who owed him favors. They came at midday, when the sun was high and unforgiving, and spread out in a half-circle around Samuel's property. Samuel and Tobias stood together on the porch, rifles in hand. They didn't speak, didn't need to. Edward rode forward, his face cold and certain. "Last chance, Samuel, hand him over and this ends." "No," Samuel said. Edward's hand moved toward his gun. And then, from behind them, more hoofbeats. Samuel turned, frowning. From the North Road, riders were coming, not strangers, men he recognized, old ranch hands, neighbors, men he'd worked beside for 20 years, men who'd heard what was happening and decided they weren't going to let cruelty run their county. First came Ben Holloway, gray-haired and steady, shotgun across his saddle. Then Mary Kowalski, a widow who'd fought off raiders during the war and wasn't about to back down now. Then others, 10, 15, 20, until Edward's men were outnumbered 2-1. Ben pulled his horse up beside Samuel and nodded. "Heard you might need a hand, Sam." Samuel stared at him, throat tight. "Ben." "Don't," Ben said. "Just don't." Edward's face went pale. His men shifted nervously, glancing at each other. "You can't," Edward started. "We can," Mary interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "And we are. Now you've got a choice, Edward Harding. You can ride out of here, or you can start something you won't finish." Edward's jaw worked. His hand hovered near his gun, but when he looked around, at the faces of men and women who weren't backing down, he knew. He was done. "This isn't over," Edward hissed. "Yeah," Samuel said quietly, "it is." Edward jerked his reins and turned his horse. His men followed, reluctant and humiliated, disappearing down the road in a cloud of dust. The silence that followed was thick with relief. Ben dismounted, walked over to Samuel and clapped him on the shoulder. "You're a damn fool, Sam." "I know," Samuel said, his voice rough. "But you're an honest fool." Ben glanced at Tobias, nodded once. "That counts." One by one, the others came forward, shaking hands, offering words, then riding off to return to their own lives. But they'd been there, and that mattered. When the last rider left, Samuel and Tobias stood alone again. "Thank you," Tobias said quietly. Samuel shook his head. "Thank them." "I will," Tobias paused, "but I'm thanking you too." Samuel looked at him, something unspoken passing between them. "Stay as long as you need," Samuel said. "No contract, no debt, just stay." Tobias nodded slowly. "I'll stay." Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Tobias mended fences, worked the horses, planted seed. He didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. The work spoke for him. So did the way he started sitting with Samuel at meals, the way he laughed, quiet and rare, but real, when Samuel told a bad joke. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tobias stood near the fence line and looked south, toward where his father's land used to be. Samuel joined him, silent. "I used to dream about going back there," Tobias said, "rebuilding, making it what it was." "You still could," Samuel said. Tobias shook his head. "No, that place died with him." He turned to look at Samuel. "But maybe I can build something new here." Samuel's throat tightened. He nodded. "I'd like that." Tobias extended his hand. Samuel took it. And as the last light faded from the sky, the two men stood together, not as debtor and savior, not as victim and guilty, but as something harder earned and more fragile. As men who'd chosen, against all odds, to stand. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the scent of dust and distance. Somewhere in the hills, a coyote called, and the ranch, small, weathered, but standing, held them both. Samuel kept a small wooden marker near the barn, carved with two names, Jacob Mercer and the man Samuel used to be, a reminder of what silence costs. And Tobias, he stayed. Not because he had to, but because, For the first time in 8 years, he wanted to.